World War I was a time of great conflict, both in the world and the United States. Particularly in terms of minorities, the U.S. did fight a total war to a moderate extent during World War I. Minorities such as Native Americans, Latinos, and African Americans proved to be an important asset towards the U.S.'s contribution to the Allied powers. The American government has recently released a recording of 3 World War I soldiers from each of these minority backgrounds discussing their war experiences. Please tune in to learn about how each of these minority groups aided in the U.S. war effort.
Well, I sure miss those good old days of the war. 10 years ago, at this time, I would have been fighting for the French. That's where I earned my croix de guerre, you know. Those were the days.
I know what you mean, but I wouldn't want to go back to those days anytime soon. We Latinos were treated pretty bad by some of the other soldiers because of our poor English speaking skills.
Really?
Our poor English made it very difficult for us to follow orders and train correctly. That's why the Camp Gordon Plan was created. It called for the separation of U.S. soldiers into their language groups so that they could train more efficiently and follow the rations better.
Camp Gordon, where's that?
Actually, most of us Latinos were trained in our native language at Camp Cody in Mexico.
Oh, I see. We African Americans were trained separately too, but not because we didn't speak English. No, we were trained separately because of our skin color. Many of us were trained at Camp Des Moines in Iowa, under the watch of white officers such as Charles Ballou.
What about you? How were you trained?
Actually, we Native Americans were trained in the same camps as white soldiers.
That's interesting. And did they treat you well?
Yes, in fact, they did. They respected our warrior backgrounds, and we had already proven ourselves during the French and Indian War, the Civil War, and countless others. But this respect came with a price. We were assigned some of the most dangerous jobs, such as snipers and scouts. Native American soldiers had a fatality rate of 5%, compared to the white American fatality rate of 1%.
Isn't it U.S. law that all men who enlist must be U.S. citizens? Correct me if I'm wrong, but weren't most Native Americans not American citizens?
You're right, but the government passed a law saying that all Native American men of military age must register, so 17,000 Native Americans ended up registering. However, the whites did initially doubt our loyalty. After the war, though, they really showed their appreciation for our efforts. All the Native American soldiers earned citizenship after the war, and the whites also wanted us to be better assimilated into society rather than isolated as tribes. This is what paved the way for future citizenship for all Native Americans.
That happened?
No. Our tribes were indeed drawn closer together after the war, but that's how it always is. We were welcomed back home with victory dances and time-honored cleansing rituals. And despite all the promises, economic disparities between the white Americans and us were just as present after the war.
Well, at least you were treated well. We were treated much worse after the war, if that's even possible. Lynching became a commonplace thing, and the southern governments turned their head the other way and let these heinous crimes happen. You know, I still long for the days of the war. At least we were treated well back then. And it's so ironic to think that when my buddies and I signed up, we thought it would improve our social standing.
That's what we Latinos thought too when we enlisted. But it was difficult in the army. We weren't allowed to rise up into very high rank or earn very many honors. Marcelino Serna, a Latino private, captured 4 German soldiers, but only received minor honors and no Medal of Honor. They said it was because he was a private and couldn't advance any further because of his English skills.
But at least you were accepted into the General Army, despite being marginalized in society. We blacks were separated into our own division, the 92nd.
Yes, I've heard that many black soldiers didn't even get to see much real war action.
That's true. The military leaders thought we were incompetent soldiers, so we didn't get to see much action. But John J. Pershing willingly lent my provisional division over to the French, who treated us as equals. That's how I earned my croix de guerre. In addition, black soldiers had about 750 battle deaths. And what's more, blacks on the home front helped out with the war effort too. Many of my relatives moved from south to the north to cities like Cleveland and Detroit to work in factories. In the north, they were allowed many more rights and were even allowed to vote. See,
We Latinos had some advantages in terms of civil rights after the war too, or at least it opened up the door to our struggle for equal rights. That reminds me of one time when I was beep.
The rest is history. So you see, the U.S.'s desperation for soldiers clearly conveyed their involvement in total war to a certain extent. Although it did not join the war until later, nor was it ever targeted as a nation on the war front or the home front, the U.S.'s need for soldiers underscores that they were in fact somewhat engaged in a total war, even to the point that they would allow previously discriminated against minorities to be soldiers. As you can infer, the U.S., as seen by the treatment of minorities in the military, did participate in a total war to a moderate extent during World War I.